Hey friends, Shelby Stanger here, host of Wild Ideas Worth Living. We're taking this week off to recover a bit from the holidays, but we wanted to introduce you to another podcast doing some amazing things. The Trail Ahead podcast is hosted by Faith Briggs and Addie Thompson. On the show, Addie and Faith bring together guests from all walks of life. They interview activists, artists, athletes, climate scientists, and outdoor industry leaders to discuss representation and access to the outdoors. On this week's episode, Faith and Addie speak with Kamilah Journét. Kamilah is a long-distance runner, marketing strategist, and environmental activist. She joins the Trail Ahead for a conversation about making the outdoors more welcoming, embracing a changing identity as a runner, finding joy through movement, and so much more. If you enjoy their conversation, you can check out more episodes from the Trail Ahead podcast. Just tune in, hit subscribe, and show them love wherever you listen. We'll be back to our regular programming next week with a guest who ran across the entire United States. Until then, here's Faith and Addie's episode with Kamilah Journét.
Welcome to the Trail Ahead, conversations at the intersection of race, environment, history, culture, and the outdoors. We're your hosts, Addie and Faith. We bring on folks from all walks of life to have real, authentic, messy dialogue that can lead to tangible change. Our guest this week is Kamilah Journét, an avid outdoor adventurer who has worked in the running industry in many capacities and also has written about questions of equity, using her own experience as a long-distance runner. It was so great to have Kamilah Journét on the podcast. Find out more via the links in our show notes. Stay tuned for the Debrief, where we discuss a topic that's come up in various episodes and in our personal lives: eco-anxiety. Okay, awesome. We're on.
Everybody, podcast now. It's our new intro. I hope everyone likes it.
Yeah, that's our intro music. Kamilah, you didn't know we were part of our recording of our new. Amazing. Welcome.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for being here today. Let's jump right into it. We always like to ask our guests to introduce themselves however they're feeling today. Whatever you feel like saying about yourself today. It doesn't have to be standard. There are no required, no required qualifications of engagement maybe that you have to mention or not.
Awesome. Well, my name is Kamilah Journét. My pronouns are she, her. I am a long-distance runner. I'm an environmentalist. I am a marketing strategist. Chef seems like a strong word, but I really like to cook, so I always love to throw that in there. And yeah, I do a lot of work with brands trying to create spaces of belonging, specifically in the outdoor industry. Oh, and I'm also co-VP of the board of directors for Runners for Public Lands, which is a 501c3 nonprofit focused on environmental stewardship and access to the lands that we all enjoy.
Oh, I love that.
So cool.
I don't know about the chef part. We might have to come back around.
I know. I was just thinking that. I love it.
Yeah. I'm like, maybe we're like the recipe of the episode.
Yeah, that's a really good call. I like that a lot.
Actually, what's the last thing that you cooked that you were really like pumped on?
The last thing I cooked, which is kind of one of my go-tos when we have company, we had some new friends in Portland over. It's actually from the Run Fast, Eat Slow cookbook. And it's this pasta with roasted butternut squash. And I usually add whatever other veggies I have. So this time I did some like sauteed kale. And then I also added some pancetta that I got all crispy. And then you make this brown butter sauce. The recipe calls for sage, but I just use whatever herbs I have, and then you mix it all together. And because the squash, I use both butternut and acorn, and so it kind of has like this sweetness to it, and it almost creates this like creamy sauce with the butter. And it's super simple, but it's like always a crowd pleaser and it's always a hit. And it's like one of my favorite fall dishes. So.
Oh, yes.
Right?
You not only chef, but also food storyteller. Like the way you just described that, I'm very hungry and I just ate. So that tells you how effective that was. That's awesome.
I'm very
Fast Eat Slow cookbook. Is that right? You said?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. I'll have to look that up. That sounds incredible.
I have it and I think I've never opened it. So maybe this is the time.
I know about it. I don't have it, but maybe I'll get it. There you go.
I was going to say I'm very impressed by people who like use cookbooks. Like my sister has like a cookbook stand and she moved to Portland, recently, and I'll like go over and she'll be like, oh, let me just see what I'm going to make today, and flips through a cookbook and sets it on the stand and then like acts accordingly. And I'm always in shock and awe. I'm like, what?
I will say I'm not that cookbook user. I'm more like, I think I have these things, and then I close it and then I like to figure it out. I think that's my favorite thing about cooking is like, you don't have to always follow the recipe exactly. So like this recipe didn't call for kale or pancetta. I just thought those flavors sounded good together. So yeah, I like to play in the kitchen a lot.
That's awesome. Well, now I want to follow the Kamilah cookbook because I want to add those ingredients to this. So I'll use the like recipe that's in the cookbook, but then have your spin on it too. Awesome. Well, yeah, we may need to come back to that question and dive in a little deeper.
Speaking of play, because you said you like to play in the kitchen.
Segue. Exactly.
What?
Great segue.
We like to ask everyone this question of what does it mean to you when we say playing outside?
For me, I would say playing outside. That's a really good question. And I know you asked this question, and I love it because I love hearing all the different answers people say. But for me, playing outside is just like a sense of freedom and also a lot of imagination. I think that even if there's moments where I've like prescribed what I want to do outside, there's always a moment where I have to like think on my feet and figure something else out. And it kind of just reminds me of like when I was a kid, my mom would very much encourage time outside, so much so that in the summer she would like lock the screen door. So I had to stay outside because she thought it was like, get out of the house. What are you doing in here? And I always just had to figure out some way to occupy myself. And that often involved playing and making things up. And I'm also an only child. So I spend a lot of time just in my head thinking through different scenarios or how things can come together. And I think on the trails or just outside in my neighborhood or outside with friends, like it's always different just depending on whatever mindset you have. So yeah, I don't know if that quite answers it, but that's kind of what comes to mind.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it really is like what it means for you. And that's why I love that you've heard those answers before, because we love hearing them on the podcast. And a lot of times we get to learn about people's childhood. Like it honestly goes back to younger years a lot of the time. Like I would say 95% of the time we really start to, it kind of like gets at, it's essentially the same question as like, what was your relationship to the outdoors like when you were younger? But we ask it in the form of play. So no, I think it definitely answers it. And it's really cool to see how those stories come to influence us now, like how we related to outdoor spaces either like does or doesn't look the same now. Like for me, it actually looks quite different than when I was younger, but it does have an influence, I think. Absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah, totally. I also was like sent outside a lot as a kid, but I'm so grateful for it now, But yeah, it took a while to like learn what play as an adult could look like.
Gosh, where to begin? I feel like there's so many different angles we could go into. I think in terms of, I had a question, Kamilah, about going off of like, you had also some great pieces in your introduction of like, there's environmentalism and then there's, brand strategist and storyteller. Like there's so many different elements to what you do. And I was just curious, like if you could elaborate a little bit on that work you do with brands and just sort of what that looks like for you and how that's, you had actually, I don't want to restate it because I think the way you said it was incredible, having that kind of purpose or North Star for you in the work you do in regards to representation, in regards to creating spaces of belonging. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Definitely. It's interesting because, well, I would definitely describe that as the work that I show up to do every day when I'm working with brands. It's actually never been a part of my job description. I say that, and I think there's probably a lot of underrepresented groups that might feel that when I say that, of just when you show up to a space, it might not be your exact role to have conversations about inclusion and belonging, but it ends up being something that's on your plate. But for me, I think it's not just something that has been added to my plate that I'm trying to push away and that I don't have an interest in. I think there really is a strong intersectionality between marketing and what is commonly referred to as DEI. And I don't know that the synergy between those has been quite unlocked yet. I would say marketing people come from like all different types of places before they end up in this job. And you can say you're a marketer and we can do completely different things because there are so many different ways to market a product, market an organization, try to bring people into a brand. But at the end of the day, for me, I feel best when I feel that the stories I'm sharing are those that people are proud to share, that people feel seen by, that makes them feel like they belong to something greater, and that ultimately shift the power from corporations back to people. Because I think that so many brands have a platform, they have an audience, they have a microphone, and that needs to be shared with those who are often unheard or less heard, or who are tokenized or only used it for visuals, or only ask things for Black History Month or Latinx History Month or around holiday that pertains to the type of person that they are. And it just feels like there's always work that needs to be done in this space, and it needs to be integrated from the beginning. It's not an add-on at the end. So while my roles within different brands may not be specifically like DEI marketing strategist, that's a part of who I am, and that's just how I show up every day. And I feel that it's kind of my, not so much duty, but it's like just a part of me to have those conversations and try and ensure that at the end of the day, whatever we put out is something that allows someone else not just to be like visually represented, but to feel that they can be a part of something larger as we try to shift what has been typically seen in this industry as the outdoors.
That's amazing. And honestly, I wanted to just thank you both for your work in this area. I mean, Faith and I talk about this a lot. Like, it is not your job to do this. It's not Faith's job. Like, it's really amazing that you both and others in the space have taken on this you said it's not your duty, but like, it's amazing that this work is something that you are driving forward because, you know, it comes back to this problem of like, it isn't anyone's job. And yet if no one's doing it, then like, can we start to see that change? And honestly, hopefully it's also a large part on frankly, the white folks in the space, in the very homogenous industries in which we like run, play, recreate, occupy, etc. But I think that having folks like y'all in the space doing this work behind the lens, in front of the lens, it's really incredible to see it. It's in great hands with both of you and others like that is, and you, Kamilah, the work you've done has been really inspiring to watch from afar at these different brands and beyond. And it's an interesting thing because it's like, I know we also talk a lot about with Faith and I and others, like about being the only or being the first. And I cannot imagine what that is like. And I mean, I can try to as an ally or a co-conspirator, but like, I will never fully, truly know. And what it means to flip through a magazine or flip through a running catalog and not see anyone that looks like me. Like it's, you know, that's the kind of, I know that's like a deep seated thing that it needs to be changed. And you're doing that work. It's really inspiring. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you for those kind words. It's definitely just a part of the job, I guess. Yeah. But yeah, it's been an interesting time to be in the space with just all of the awakening, as many refer to it, that's been happening. So
yeah, it's so strange. And I think the strangeness is complicated by what you said, Addie, in front of the lens and behind it, because I think that there's this strangeness of positioning that of like literally using our own bodies and our own experiences too, to have to like show and prove and exemplify why changes are needed. And I think it comes, I say this a lot, but I think it comes back to this idea of like with privilege comes responsibility, and people who come from historically and ongoing marginalized communities are usually that much more able to recognize their own privilege because they see inequity, versus I think when you have been like living a life where you haven't needed to see inequity, the process of then realizing the privilege that you have and like harnessing it for a greater good or harnessing for change is one that is often A, very difficult, but B, like also unwelcome. So it's so strange to be in this space where like, okay, you're with much effort, right? like getting access to these spaces. And then when in those spaces, whether it be running at a certain level or like working within a certain industry and sphere and being in like an inner circle of decision making or and weighing in on decision making, there's so much effort to just get there. And then when you're there, you don't get to just like be the way that others are, right? Like you're showing up to every start line with more in terms of identity, with more in terms of a sense of just an understanding of what the world is like, and then having to carry that weight with you too, whether it's literally running through the race with it or whether it's like mustering the energy and the confidence to like raise your hand and say a thing when a thing clearly needs to be said, but no one else in the room is going to say it. And I like, speak from my own experience as well with those things where sometimes it's like exhausting. And at the same time, if you don't say it, things can go out into the world from a marketing standpoint that just lack perspective, or that can be harmful to a community, or that can just be really simplistic and like don't create nuance. So there's all of that. I feel like I'm rambling, but there's all of that. And then there's the like physically your own body, right? Because I think for you and for myself, like it's often images of us, or it's like writing that we're doing, that's personal writing, that's paired with images of us. There's this other way of like putting yourself out there for a larger purpose, but it also like backlash happens, right? There's people that are like, responding on Twitter or like adding comments to the magazines or like telling whoever the platform is that they don't agree with having to talk about politics or having to talk about race in this space. And why are you trying to ruin my magazine? So it's like very bizarro, I would agree, these times that we're living in.
Yes. So much of that resonates, and it's bizarre and it's strange, and sometimes it is like I exist in these spaces that at one point I almost feel like, because there wasn't so much of a spotlight on this work, they were like my internal conversations. Like, of course, I noticed if I wasn't only in a space, but it wasn't really discussed. And now it's almost like the pendulum has swung the entire other direction. And it's like the topic of discussions in places where like I never thought these discussions would happen. And while I'm thankful for those safe places where it can be helpful and it can help build and it can be something that's necessary, there's also a lot of unsafe spaces that exist now, because there's a certain level of like comfort that people have in discussing certain things, and that can lead to awkwardness, and like it feels heavy in a way as well. So it's like constantly having to assess like where I am, who is here, I need to say this, it might not be received well, how do I say it in a way that like puts others' comfort first, but I need to put my comfort first. But like it's a constant mind game. And for someone who already spends like way too much time in their head overthinking and like people pleasing, it's draining. And I found that it's something that I have to like sometimes just take a step back from And that, like, navigating all of that, I don't know how to do it perfectly. I don't think anyone does, but it's just a weight that is constant. So I think finding those outlets for like joy and play are especially important right now.
Yeah. Wow. The way that you just said that, of like, it feels like the conversations you've always been having in your head have come out into public space, and that's often uncomfortable. Like, that totally resonates with me. And it's very strange to go from talking about it and thinking about it yourself to suddenly it's like the topic of a panel. And you're like, whoa, is everyone here in the audience even like trying to have this conversation? Because sometimes they're not. And then that's like really uncomfortable too. It's a very strange navigation, but I feel that too. It's like suddenly your internal dialogue is being listened to, investigated, desired in a way it never has been before. And it's very strange.
That's so interesting. Thank you both for sharing this, because I think that like this is the kind of thing that I'm learning as we're talking right now.
It's interesting to me because I feel like what we're talking about is learning how to take up space and when to share it. And it makes me think of like this. I think I can't remember what kind of meeting I was in that was being run by someone who was a DEI specialist. And as we were setting community agreements at the beginning, it was like basically talking about like step up, step back, step aside. And I think we've talked about this before, but in terms of like sharing power and sharing space, knowing, and it is not easy to learn, but knowing when to step up and speak. And potentially sometimes that's like when your voice is going to be heard the most and you need to speak for yourself and others. Step aside, which is like sometimes it's creating space for someone who maybe doesn't have as much power in the space. It might be going back and saying like, actually, so-and-so had a really good point, or maybe that person wasn't being listened to, and being like, actually, so as so-and-so was saying earlier, I think like, so giving like, you know, acknowledging what people are saying, or step back, which is like, this isn't the time for me to be leading this conversation. This is the time for me to be listening. And I think learning that is very difficult, but that feels like one of the new skills that people are being asked to learn and like move to. And it's, you know, for me, and it's not even just for like white men, but I think like that's a space where it's like, okay, work on being aware of the amount of space you're taking up in a room. And like, I think people bristle at that because they're like, what does that even freaking mean about how much space I take up? Like, we're not literally talking about your physical body most of the time, right? Except it's like, but it's also like you're learning that. And then it's also learning, like, I most of the time will answer a question. Like, I personally most of the time will raise my hand, or I will respond, or I will weigh in. And when I find myself in a group where maybe others aren't as ready, I'm like, learn, like, maybe I can create space by saying, did anyone else like have something they want to say? Or just by not speaking first, right? And waiting and creating the uncomfortable tension where maybe someone else is like, okay, I need to say this thing because it's not going to be said. But so I don't know. I think what I'm trying to say is, as we're talking about the quote unquote awakening or the quote unquote reckoning that's happened, it asks a lot of people of color because we're the ones that are immediately looked to and turned to answer the questions. But I think, as we're also saying, it asks a lot of white people, or people that in other ways have historically held levels of power and privilege, to learn what does it mean to wield that power and privilege.
Yeah, I resonate with so much of what you're saying, Faith. And it's interesting because I am probably that person that sometimes is in a room and does not speak. Not because I don't have anything to say, but because the way that I process information is very different. And I'm often full of thoughts after a meeting. I'm like a really great follow-upper. Like, I can eloquently write an email that summarizes like everything that was said or that could be changed, or my thoughts, because I'm an observer by nature. It's just kind of always been who I am. I like to people watch. I like to read the comments on posts, for better or worse. I enjoy like observing people, from just being out and about to like watching a trashy reality TV show and just trying to figure out like why their minds work the way that they do. And so in a lot of these conversations, when things get like too heavy, I again go back to my internal monologue of like, okay, what is this person trying to say, even if it's not coming out like that? Or what is the end goal? Or what are the commonalities and the things that are being said by this group as a collective? And how do we move forward? And like, that's just how my brain is working. And it's taken me a long time to be comfortable even saying that. And it's taken me a long time to get to a point where when I start a new position, I will often tell my manager, it's not that I'm not paying attention. It's not that I have nothing to say. This is just how I process information in order to help us close loops and like move things forward. So I very much appreciate when there's someone like you, Faith, in a room who checks in to see if at the end of a talk or at the end of a meeting, someone else has something to say, because I typically will. I just don't take up space in the same way that others may in those situations.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, it's really fascinating to hear both of you talk about this, because I think it goes back to what you said, Faith, about with great privilege comes great responsibility. It's like that whole idea of passing the mic, right? We talked about this with Jose Gonzalez, like what power are you willing to give up, and who do you want to bring into the space? And actually, not to, hopefully this isn't embarrassing you in any way, Kamilah, but I saw you speak on a panel a couple of weeks ago at the Mammoth Trail Fest. And I just really appreciated that, you know, you were bringing a variety of different perspectives to this panel, and at the same time, like your own experience as a Black woman in the outdoors. And you were also talking about Indigenous lands and how the lands were forcibly stolen from tribes. Like, and I was so struck by you were using the power and, you know, the platform you had as a speaker that day to also shed light on other oppressed communities. And that to me is a perfect example. I mean, like Faith's work with cultural appropriation in fashion and other Indigenous co-conspirator allyship work you've done, like both of you, I think like just really exemplify the ability to share your own experience. And again, which is like way above and beyond, and yet also find the time and energy and space to advocate on behalf of other communities. So I think it's fascinating to see this work happen.
As we sit here recording this podcast, I look to my right and I see not one, but two Patagonia black hole duffel bags. And I know that inside is yet another black hole Patagonia organizing cube.
This sounds very familiar. People are constantly making fun of me for having every size imaginable of the black hole bags. My toiletry bag, my backpack, which is also sitting next to me right now as well, and 3 different duffel sizes. So you could basically call me obsessed. People do.
Same. I have a shiny red one. I have a shiny purple one. I gave away another shiny green one. And I have a shiny olive green backpack version that is my favorite carry-on. And I have to say, one thing I love about them is that I can always find my bag super easily at the baggage claim. Yeah. And they have options with wheels.
My favorite thing is that with Patagonia's Worn Wear program, you technically never have to buy another bag because you can just send it in for free. Over the course of 5 years of having my original black hole backpack, I got mine repaired a few times, and finally they just gave me a new one. So basically I've had the same bag since 2014, which I'm really proud of.
So impressive. Yeah, they're durable. They fit everything. Get it? It's a black hole. That's the thing. And they're made with 100% recycled body fabric, lining, and webbing.
What we're saying is 5 stars from the trail ahead, 10 out of 10 would recommend.
Absolutely. Check out Patagonia's black hole bags, learn more about Patagonia sustainability, and find ways to get involved in your local community with Patagonia Action Works, all at patagonia.com. I mean, I'd love for folks that know nothing about you, Kamilah, to maybe talk a little bit about your journey as a runner, some background in it, and maybe what you enjoy about it. And then maybe we can talk about like where you're at now in terms of your relationship with running.
Yes. So let's see now. I've been, I guess what stereotypically, or I don't know, within this space you say is a runner half my life now. I started running when I was 14, my freshman year of high school. The reason I started running was, one, I always just loved like the feeling of going fast and being outdoors as a kid, like tag, capture the flag, like race you across the field. Like those were my jams. Tried soccer. My favorite part of soccer was the running. It always kind of felt like something that I had interest in. But when I was in 8th grade, my family relocated back to Southern California from Maryland. I was born in Southern California. I moved to the East Coast when I was 8. I moved back March of 8th grade. A really hard time to move. And when I started at my new middle school, I basically had, 4 months to like make friends before high school. And one of my friends told me that cross country was just like track and field. It's not, but I didn't know that. And so I checked the box for cross country on the form that my mom had already signed that said I wanted to do track. The next thing I knew, summer was starting and I got a big packet of forms in my mailbox and was told to show up for practice all summer long. And my mom looked and she's like, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And I was like, "Yeah, like my only friend is doing it. Like I'm going to go." So as preparation for cross country summer camp, I told my mom I needed to run a little bit because I'd only ever run like the mile in school. I wasn't super fast or anything. So my run was half a mile downhill to the donut shop where my mom was awaiting to pick me up to drive me back home. Those were my first actual like runs, but I took to the sport of cross country. I really enjoyed it. I mostly enjoyed that it was something that I did outside with my friends. I think pretty much all of my friends were on the cross country team. I also am super competitive. I don't want to say to a fault, but maybe. So I loved racing. I loved that me and my 2 best friends were always like fighting for like first, second, or third just between our friend group. But it was always something that was fun and we enjoyed it. And it wasn't until I got to track after a fall season of goofing off. I carried that goof off, have fun nature into track, but started running considerably quicker than my friends. I think my freshman year, I must have run in maybe like the 5:40s for the mile or something. And my coach decided at that point that I needed to run with a different group. Long story short, I ended up running pretty decently in high school. Loved cross country. Cross country and track were my everything. Like I loved the people. I loved the teammates. I loved my friends. I loved the friends that I made just at practice that I didn't even hang out with outside of the sport, but I enjoyed sharing miles with them. I loved being inspired by our female assistant coach. I loved that she brought her kids and we pushed them in the stroller on our runs. Like it was just the best family. And then, I went on to run in college. That was a bit harder. I never quite found my footing. I struggled with anemia. I struggled with understanding my body and how it was changing. And I took time off. I graduated my junior year, stopped running completely. No running for a couple years. And then I started coaching high school cross country and track, which brought back all of the wonderful memories of high school running and ultimately led me back into the sport. And so I've definitely had this kind of up and down of like, I'm running all the time, or I'm not running at all, or I love running, or I don't love running. But I would say the consistency of what I've kind of realized is I enjoy moving my body. I enjoy being social with my friends, and I really love to compete. So yeah, that's, I guess, in a nutshell, me as a runner.
It's super cool. And it's interesting to yeah, I resonate with a lot of that. And I love your first runs being like down to the donut shop and then like coming home with your mom. I definitely like when I started running cross country in high school, it was essentially like my track coach made me do it. And I had no idea like distances and things like that. But later on in my life, actually, when I started running longer distances, like running to a place that was fun was a huge motivator for me of being like, I'm going to run to the donut shop. And I was living in New York at the time. And so it was like so easy to just like hop on the train back or like figure out how to get my way back without actually having to run. That was like ideal. But yeah, there's like also a lot of pressure, and when your body changes or you deal with injuries or all those things, like that core sense of identity that comes from being part of a group can be really altered too. So it's not always like simple and straightforward. If performance is a part of it, but it's maybe not the whole reason you're there, but then like if the performance gets threatened or altered in any way, like all the other things that are a part of it kind of feel under threat, which can be difficult.
I really struggled with that coming from in high school, I was running like 60, 70 mile weeks and running really well and really competitively. And anemia is a really sneaky kind of like, it's not an injury. Your body is like slowly refusing to do what you're asking of it. And for that to happen at the point that it felt like running was who I was and running fast was a part of who I was. And now I had a new team that only knew me on paper, but never actually seen me compete at the level that I was like supposed to. I mean, you get recruited, like you're brought to a place to perform at a certain level. So for me, I really struggled with trying to understand like why my body was failing me, which brought me to the point of like counting every calorie that I consumed and like portioning out all of my meals and like going to the gym late at night to try and figure out like, well, it must be like this extra like couple pounds, or it must be that I'm not strong enough, or it must be that I'm not running enough or something. And in a weird way, that experience of me basically not fueling my body led to a practice where I almost passed out at the end because I wasn't feeling. And my coach being like, something's not quite right here. And he sent me to the sports psychologist. And well, initially I went to the sports psychologist to try and master my disordered eating. I ended up using all of those therapy sessions once we got past that to figure out who I was, if not a runner. And it really like released a lot of the pressure I was putting on myself, because it allowed me to talk through like what else was going on in my life and how else did I exist in this space. And like, if I didn't have running, who would I be? And it's not that running isn't a part of me, but it doesn't have to be the number one. Like, my friends like me because I run. My boyfriend likes me because I run. It was like, there's other pieces of myself. So I started going to therapy when I was 19 years old, and now I'm 30 and I still go to therapy. And it's like the best thing that I think I could have hoped for, is knowing that it's okay to talk through things and just figuring out who we are as people. So in a way, all of that distress also brought me something that I'm really thankful for.
Yeah. I mean, I started going to therapy about 2 years ago. And then part of that has also been for me running, this like unpacking identity around running, which was like so central to my life, and trying to figure out how it can be a part of my life and it can be something I love, but it doesn't have to be everything. So cool that that is a practice that you started at the age of 19. And I think it's really maybe important and interesting to note that like, it's not a, like, I'll say in college, I think I went through a therapist twice. Like, I went and I just dumped everything on them and I was like, cool, I feel better, I'm not going back. And like, no, like 10 years practice, however long it is, to have to be able to talk through some things. Like, it's so good to be able to unpack that. So I'm happy for you and your therapy journey. I am a big proponent of therapy. I might add some resources on where people can start their therapy journey on this, because I think it's something that's really important. And it doesn't have to be oh, I'm broken, so I have to go to therapy. Yeah.
Totally.
I think it's a really hard one to talk about. And in college, I was the captain of the track team. And in spring, that also meant that everyone that ran cross country and everyone was then transitioned to be our distance side of the squad I was their captain suddenly. And cross had, just by the nature of how much you're running, and there was a lot more disordered eating on the distance side. And it was something that I was really unprepared to be trying to address. And I think having the team talk to a nutritionist was one part, but that sports psychologist part would have been really helpful, because I think when you are holding your identity so close to performance, you do think you can fix it. You do think that if you eat the right thing, or eat the less of what you perceive to be the wrong thing, or build some arm muscle or whatever it is, that you can fix it. And most of the time you can't on your own, but it's hard. I do want to shout out a recent film called This Is Beth, that maybe I'll be able to link to if it's out too, but it's about Beth Roden's struggle with disordered eating. She's a climbing athlete at a really high level. And I just think it's really great to see more narratives like that coming into the open.
Yes. And I definitely think that for me, for a long time, I was well, I don't even share about my disordered eating because it doesn't feel serious enough. But I think it's important to be open in those conversations, and maybe just to share that it's something that a lot more people struggle with than I think we're ever really realizing. Because you have to learn to eat all over again at a grown adult age, or maybe you're younger or whatnot. For me, I felt like I was an adult, and I had to learn how to eat again. So it is definitely something that I think, especially in the sport of distance runner, there's a lot of it that just doesn't go discussed.
I wanted to respond with also just thanking you again. I feel like I'm thanking you a lot, because there's a lot to thank you for, Kamilah, for just talking about this. Because I think that this is something that is extremely taboo in a lot of our these distance running sports. And it sounds like it is as well in ultra running. It definitely exists. And I think in addition to the film that Faith mentioned, I just also saw the film that Deuster made, film about Tim Tollefson, who's an ultra runner in the ultra community, and who also hosted Mammoth Trail Fest. This all ties in together. It was just about, he talks about body dysmorphia and needing to change the way you look, and being on presentation, and not just feeling into your body, but also what others are thinking of it. It made me so emotional to watch that, because, and yet so proud at the same time. I'm so grateful to him for talking about that. And I'm grateful to you both for talking about it too. We need to all be talking about it, I think, a lot more. And I just want to destigmatize and de-taboo this topic, because I think the more we talk about it, the more it will feel folks are not alone. And also on the therapy topic, folks can seek help too. Mm-hmm. And there is a way out. And hearing some of the statements, I will link to that film too. I encourage folks to watch that as well. It's hard, especially if you've ever gone through anything like this. It's very hard to watch. And I think just because some of the things that he describes, or have had someone in your life that has struggled with some things like this, it's very raw, it's very real. And I was really appreciative to him and the team that made it, because it does start to, bring these things into the mainstream discourse in the ultra community and beyond. I don't know how mainstream any of the ultra community is, but that for me is a really important part of this dialogue.
I can't wait to see that film too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, it sounds like, Kamilah, it sounds like you both chatted about this recently, but on the topic of past being a runner, not always running, it sounds like you've started biking a little bit more. It's really interesting as we're talking about the identity of a runner, and what does it mean to be a runner? What is a runner? Who is a runner?
And am I a runner? Like, it's very interesting topics. And at the same time, there's so many other components to being an athlete and moving your body through spaces and landscapes. So I was curious to hear more about your journey with biking and like other activities you've picked up.
Yes, I would definitely have to give a lot of credit to my husband for the plethora of activities I now do outside of running. He grew up in the French Alps and is the epitome of just like an endurance athlete. We also just have really different mindsets, I think, when it comes to being active.
One of the things I love about spending time outside are all of the lessons we learn from the world around us. Like the fact that the sun always comes back out after a storm, or how even if an early snow happens, often those budding flowers can shake it off and still bloom to welcome spring. Or how a hike or a run might seem impossible if you look at it all at once. But when you take it step by step, go your own pace, and just put one foot in front of the other, you can get there and surprise yourself. Take your next step in the outdoors and do it with a trusted friend, Merrill. One trail, and that trail is for everyone. Learn more at Merrill.com. And if it's your first time shopping with Merrill, take 20% off your gear with the code TRAILAHEAD20.
For me, as I mentioned, I'm rather competitive. And for him, he just really loves training. He loves what it does for his body, and he loves that his body can take him places. Ironically, he jokes, and then I say he jokes, and then he says it's not a joke because it's true, that when we started dating, I kind of stopped running. So we found other activities to do. I got a gravel bike, ironically, like right before COVID started, and everyone bought bikes. So I got lucky in that sense that bikes used to just be in stock and you could buy them when you wanted to. And despite having always had a bike in college and used it for short commutes and whatnot, I kind of felt like I was learning how to ride a bike all over again, learning that you didn't have to sprint up every hill, but sometimes you just slow down and you shift your gears and you take your time, learning that I could bike 20 miles or 30 miles or 50 miles or 60 miles. And my main purpose for biking is to do the same things I look forward to with running in a way. I found I needed space from running, but I really just wanted to be social with my friends and like keep up with them. That's pretty much why I do sport, and I'm slowly figuring that out. Biking is a great mode of transport because you can go so much further. And we've done some bikepacking trips. We've done them where like we pack all of our stuff and we go camping and we carry everything on our bike. And we've also did what we called like a bougie bike camping trip with our friends Jim and Jess. And we stayed in bed and breakfast, but we still carried like clothes and gear and stuff on our bikes. And we went wine tasting. And it was the furthest I'd ever biked in a day, done multiple days in a row. So like my biggest biking week ever. But it was so much fun because there was like a purpose. It was a vacation. We were spending time together. We were drinking wine. We were enjoying the California coast. And it was probably one of the hardest things I've done, but also like the least exhausted I've been at the end of a vacation, which sounds weird, but you know, when you cram too much into a vacation and then you feel like you need a vacation after your vacation because
Absolutely,
you were just running around. This was just like relaxing in a way. Like I knew I had to get on my bike. I knew I had to get somewhere. I knew there was no other way to get there but biking. And I also knew we were going to have like a nice dinner and a glass of wine and a comfy bed. And then we'd do it again the next day. So yeah, I've really enjoyed those kinds of moments on the bike. I'm definitely thankful that I'm trying new sports, even though I'm really bad at them, because it kind of, I have to turn off that competitive side of my brain. Like when I go skiing, I'm not a great skier, so I can't really compete with most of the people on the mountain. So instead, I just get to focus on my experience and why I'm there and who I'm with. And I think finding those reasons in sport is kind of what keeps me coming back to it.
I love that. I also love the fact that like that's part of the beauty of doing other things. Like me too. Like I'm so competitive in anything that I'm good at. But if I'm not, then I get to just like try and fail and fall and get up and learn and make progress and be excited about that progress, you know, whether it's biking or skiing. We can go be bad at those things together since we now live in the same place. But I also want your route. I'm like, that California, that sounds great. I'm like, let's do it. Sign me up.
Yes. Would love that.
I think that is one of the beautiful things about spending time outside and these outdoor activities. Like, obviously, even having time for leisure, having time to rest comes with a certain amount of access and privilege. And like, I have a lot of gratitude for, in many places in your adult life, you don't get a chance to try and fail. You don't get a chance to do something new. Like, you're expected to be an expert in everything. And I think those are like one of the lessons that we can take from spending time outside is like, it can be hard and that can be okay. And like, you can not be pro or not be expert and that can be okay. Like, I really appreciate those like reminders of vulnerability and like newness that I get from spending time outside.
Yes, I definitely think kind of coming back to what it means to like belong to the outdoors and show belonging. It's acknowledging that a plethora of experiences exist in this space. And it's not always just about the pinnacle or the best or the fastest, but there's so much more that the outdoors give us in terms of just recharging and recentering and finding community and feeling like you're a part of something. And for me, I definitely think that I've felt comfortable trying a lot of these new things because the people around me have been so supportive and welcoming. And you think like, well, why would people not be? But people aren't always supportive and welcoming. Like there's a lot of stigma around who belongs in certain spaces and who doesn't. But I'm really, I guess, in my case, sometimes I find that with running, it was easier to show up to spaces because I was good at it. And so I kind of felt like I could show up to start line and like I belong because I'm fast. And with biking or skiing, it, especially with skiing, it's a journey in like accepting that I'm taking up space somewhere where like I could be seen as an annoyance or someone that like shouldn't be there because I'm not getting down the mountain as fast as someone else. Or I might not always remember the exact way that I'm supposed to do something, and just kind of like reminding myself to release that and just be present in the moments that I'm creating in the space.
Yes. And also those people making you feel that way, needing to release that. It's like at some point, everyone was a newbie. At some point, everyone was learning. And like learning and being in a learning space shouldn't be seen as an annoyance to someone else. It's like, oh, I'm sorry. Did you just come out of the womb knowing how to ski? Like, fuck you. You know, like that is so crazy, man. People being like, oh, you're not holding your skis right, or like, oh, you're not, you know, with like fishing, it's like, I think it's so funny because I'll like, you know, I fly fish and I can be like hard on myself when my cast is like not doing what I want it to do. And then I love, like, I was out fishing recently and my friend who's a guide was like, bugs in the water, right? Yeah. And I was like, sure is, you know, like bugs in the water. Fish can't see your stupid cast anyway. Like maybe they'll bite it, maybe they won't. But all of this like stuff around, I don't know. I've been really excited about different conversation I've had about creating a different culture in the outdoors that can be welcoming and inciting. And like the stoke doesn't necessarily need to be because it's like a sick pow day, but the stoke can be like because somebody is having a great time or doing something new, and that is like as exciting, you know. And I don't know, I hope we can like actually figure out ways to create space for each other. Yeah. And celebrate each other.
I also wanted to ask you just if you have other pieces we haven't touched on, or if there were, I know you've had a lot of conversations that are recorded and out in the world, but like, I wonder just if there are things that, my guess is you get asked about running a lot, but like, I love that you're also a chef, and you also mentioned environmentalist, which is obviously very clear through your work with Runners for Public Lands and, other things that you're involved with. But just wanted to ask you like an open-ended question of like, what do you wish people asked you? Or like, what do you want to talk about that we haven't talked about today?
It's funny because the first thing that comes to mind isn't so much a question. It's almost just like my, I don't know, self-anxiety that like perpetually exists. These words might come out a bit sloppy, but I feel like for myself personally, I have spent a lot of time talking about running, and I've spent a lot of time talking about belonging in outdoor spaces, and I've spent a bit of time talking about the environment or whatnot, and more so than there being like a specific topic that I feel like I don't get asked about. I think what I sometimes struggle with is just the fact that myself and everyone else is intersectional and is full of a variety of different pieces that allow them to show up in a variety of different spaces in different ways. Even for me, I'm like playing back all of the different things we've talked about, and what my like linear analytical like marketing mind says is like, what is the thread of this story? Because we've touched on so many different pieces. We've touched a little bit on running. We've touched a little bit on the environment. We've touched a little bit on race. We've touched a little bit on disordered eating. We've touched on youth and play and the outdoors. And I was thinking as we were speaking, like, well, what is the thread? And then it sounds really cheesy, but I was like, well, the thread is me. Like, they're all pieces of me that have allowed me to get to the point I'm at. And I think something I've honestly really struggled with since the awakening of 2020, when it felt like a lot of people realized that I was a Black distance runner, something that I had realized for most of my life, was that it felt like people were trying to put me in some sort of a box of, you belong here, and these are the stories you tell, and these are the spaces where you exist. And I think social media does a lot of that to us, where we feel like we have to show up in a certain way to the people that are following or the people that are paying attention, or you show up in a certain way at work or with your friends or whatnot. And I've just kind of been challenging myself to allow myself to just be and to accept that maybe one day I'm on a panel talking about public lands and how there's a need to acknowledge that they're all actually stolen lands, and being a voice for people that were not on that panel. And some days I'm commuting to grab a donut in Portland because it's something that sounds great that day. And some days I'm binge watching Netflix on the couch, and some days I'm cooking a delicious meal. But it's all of these different experiences that allow me to be me. And I don't know if I'm going anywhere with that, but I often think about that when I'm speaking on a podcast, or when I'm writing something, or when I'm meeting someone and I'm asked, like, how do I describe myself? Because all of these pieces together are what make me me. So there's probably something I've forgotten or something else that we could touch on. But in general, I'm really just thankful for this space to talk through a variety of different pieces, and maybe there's some things in here that I haven't discussed before. And yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's just kind of what came to mind.
No, that's awesome. As you were saying that, you're like, what's the thread? And in my head, I was like, it's you. So I'm glad we had the same connection there. No, that's so awesome, Kamilah. And I'm so glad we could provide that space. And, I think it is really easy to we do it all the time. Faith and I talk about introductions, and we sort of like removed all the like titles, and like when we introduced ourselves on the podcast recently, I think, I said totally different things from what I usually do, just because when you strip away these components. It's like, what am I? And, what or who, like, what titles do I have or whatever. And it's so easy to put people in like certain boxes and be like, oh, this guest this week is this. And we do this on the podcast. We'll probably do this intro for you. But what's so funny about that is that there's so much, I think was it Jose Faith that's like becoming the multitudes of you, discovering the multitudes of you, and we just talked to Patagonia, like all the different identities that folks bring on this podcast each and every time we talk to someone. It is so great to be able to say like, yeah, you're a runner. And also like, we know that, you're so much more, or what do you identify as? Like, what is most exciting to you these days? And sometimes we have folks on that like, maybe I'll have a preconceived notion about what we're going to talk about. And then like joke's on me because what they want to talk about is vastly different. And like, we want to create that space. I'm so glad we got to, I loved getting to know you better. And like you are the thread. And I'm so happy that this created that space. And it's also such a joy to have you on with us. So thank you.
Thank you.
I was on a panel with Grace Anderson, who we'll hopefully have on the pod sometime soon, a few years ago. And we both were like talking about bios and intros. And then we both did this exercise of rewriting our bios. It was really fun. And like, we basically took out anything that was like a typical thing to include. And it was like, I talk about like my favorite authors and the feelings that I like, and I think that's like, I really appreciate Noelle Russell for that too, because I was recently like on another prep call with her and she's like, introduce yourself in whatever way you'd like. And maybe that's like, she's just basically like, I think like what your pets' names are and what you like to eat feels as important as anything else. And I'm like, yeah, like my name is Faith. I have a dog named Moses and I really love green grapes. Like that is valid as well. And could bring in like all these other facets of conversation that wouldn't have been if I was like, I'm a runner and I host a podcast and like I make films, kind of thing. So yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here with us, for sharing so many different aspects of yourself. It's just like great to be able to wax and wane, I think, together and like talk about these different things.
Thank you for having me on. Really appreciate it.
This is the Debrief, and we're very excited after months of trying to plan to have you join us. Sarah, would you introduce yourself in whatever way you normally would, or however you're feeling today?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm excited to talk with you about this topic. It's obviously close to my heart and I have a lot of thoughts about it. So I'll try to be brief in this debrief. But I'm Sarah Jacquette, and I'm a professor and chair of the Environmental Studies Department at Cal Poly Humboldt in Arcata, California, on Wiyot territory, far north in the Redwoods. Yeah, I'm an author of a book that came out in 2020 called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet.
Amazing. We're like so excited because we're like, we've been wanting to talk about this and you've literally wrote the book on it.
I like to think that I had something to offer there, and I couldn't believe it in the middle of writing it that the youth climate strikes happened in 2019. I said, oh, it's not just my students who feel this way. There's a whole generation out there. So it was both validating and of course, a little bit heartbreaking.
Yeah, of course. And I know that we came across you and an article that you wrote that Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson actually posted online. But before we get into the article, because I know that goes a little bit different of a direction or kind of dives into some of the nuances of eco-anxiety, of climate anxiety. Can you give us a definition in your words of what climate anxiety is?
Sure. That's always a funny question, right? Because you're thinking, oh, I've been thinking about this for so long. I ought to have one right off the top of my head. But, it's not that, it's actually really, really up in the air, of course. And if you want to go really basic on the most simplistic direction, you can take the American Psychological Association's definition of eco-anxiety as the chronic fear of environmental doom. But I think not to go off on not too far, but climate anxiety has become kind of a catch-all term for a lot of different emotions and shorthand for just if you're feeling a lot of big feelings like scared and afraid and anxious and depressed and heartbroken and grieving and all of the rest, anger, all of it is kind of clustered underneath that umbrella term, just because it's been such an easy term that's grabbed onto pop culture pretty quickly.
I think it's come up quite a bit in the podcast with different guests who express feeling eco-anxiety. And I think in one of the ways that it shows up is this feeling of not knowing how to take action, not knowing what to do, feeling stuck in the grocery store when trying to decide like which packaging to bring home or not. And I think in bigger ways, which is still like an everyday thing of like, I didn't want to be in this store for this long and now I'm here like struggling. And then I've had other friends, once again in the place of decision making, being like, I don't know if I want to have kids. Like, what if the best thing I can do for the environment is not to become a mother? And so I think it's shown up in all these different ways. And I wonder, when you were writing the book, what prompted you and what were you trying to get across?
Yeah, that range of things, absolutely, all underneath the category of climate anxiety. Even people say under climate anxiety, we categorize things like experiencing actual trauma of having your community have to move because of sea level rise and the anxieties that causes. And, something like being in the grocery store trying to figure out the packaging, or something like having a child. And all of these things are quite varied. I mean, they're hugely different in terms of the immediacy of the threat, the intensity of the threat, the temporal scale of the threat. And so it doesn't really do them all a service to cluster them all into one category. So you're getting a little bit at where we're going to go here about thinking about the kind of racial and demographic nuances around the term that we might want to be pushing. But yeah, what I wanted to do with the book basically was I saw the generation of students that I had been teaching for a few years increasingly as a phenomenon, not just a one-off student, but whole clusters of them and the whole class finding themselves emotionally not equipped to go to classes, do their homework, save the world, whatever it is that they were trying to do, and that we were promising on our websites and brochures and stuff, come to this program and learn how to do all this awesome stuff and be a climate warrior or whatever. And they were not anywhere near that, because they were just so despaired and anguish, and almost to the point of some point students would get even apathetic or even nihilistic. And that existential, emotional story of response that they were having to information about the climate emergency started to really concern me. And I wrote the book as a way to research and then try to translate the research for young people, for college age students, to be able to get all that research synthesized in a digestible package, to answer the question of what is existentially needed in this moment to rise to the occasion of the climate crisis. Because obviously not showing up to class, much less being able to participate in collective activism, is not going to get us anywhere. So what did the planet need from us emotionally to have that inner resolve, that inner stamina, that inner resilience, if you will, to carry on the work for our lives? And I turn the lens inward, and realize, I had thought that inner work was surplus to requirements, or we could do that stuff after the revolution. But it turns out that many wisdom traditions and many social movements will tell you that if you're not taking care of your heart and body, there is no resistance movement to speak of. That is actually the fuel of the movement. And so I realized, oh gosh, my students are burning themselves out worrying about this before they've even taken part in trying to change something. So it'll become a self-fulfilling prophecy. All this doom and gloom they're hearing is going to depress them so much that they're not going to be able to even try to battle that doom and gloom. And then where are we going to be left? So that was my concern. I was really worried about the planet and also my students.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think I've certainly seen it working with being fortunate enough myself to work with some youth climate activists. I've certainly seen it drive them forward and really deeply concern. And it's not just a youth phenomenon, I guess, but it's really interesting how it shows up there. And I mean, to the point of, we know Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson also has her Venn diagram that she speaks of very often, where it's what is needed in the climate fight, in this climate work. What are you good at specifically? And then the third one is what brings you joy? Because her whole thing, same as what you just said, is if we're burning ourselves out,
if it's not sustainable work from a joy and fulfillment perspective, that's not sustainable in the long run. And I know that finding something that brings you joy is also different than being anxious about a changing climate. But even navigating that sort of fine line there is quite interesting.
Yeah. And you think about the people that you talk to who are spending a lot of times out in nature and outdoors.
Yeah.
And a lot of times as psychologists, the sort of standard line for coping with climate anxiety is make sure you spend some time in nature in addition to other things. And I think that really is a complex prescription because, of course, spending the time in nature also can be very triggering for people who feel, who can really feel almost empathically nature's being threatened, right? And you're out there and you're thinking, these birds are so beautiful, but they're going to die. I mean, it's a sense of real doom even in being in nature. So it complicates things a bit. Yeah, I have a lot to.
Absolutely. And well, no, I mean, just to your point about, indigenous communities watching their lands change, or people, those who are very, very tied to the land and have seen these changes very visibly over the past however many, well, since time immemorial, certainly, but like over the past few decades more concretely. So that's super interesting. I mean, I think on that topic, this is where we maybe dive a little bit deeper, because when Faith and I came across your work, again, it was something that we saw that Ayana posted. It was your article called Climate Anxiety is an Overwhelmingly White Phenomenon. And of course, both Faith and I were like, wait a minute, we need to read this. This is fascinating. What does this mean? Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear a little bit more about not just what the article, if you can tell listeners what the article basically summarize the article or talk a little bit more about what it says. But at the same time, I'm really curious how you got to this point from your book and writing and your work, how you started to shift into seeing this or realizing this, because it seemed from the research I've done about you, it seemed like you sort of, it morphed over time. Like it wasn't something that you went into writing the book with in your mind, but I'd love to hear more from you.
Yeah, that's so interesting you point that out too, because I remember my first book was called The Ecological Other. And that book was more of an academic book, certainly not written to be read by college students, although some are forced to do so, and I feel sorry for them. But anyway, I wrote it as a dissertation and a book, as part of the grind of being an academic. The topic of that book was sort of the question, why is the environmental movement so bad at taking on social justice? Why is the environmental movement so white? And then that book, I looked at the emotion of disgust, environmentalist disgust, and how over time since about as early as the late 18th century, but even earlier than that, there was this kind of disgust related to land, the environment, property, that kind of thing that was a thread throughout and that got to the environmental movement. And so I was always interested in the kind of embedded green hate, as Betsy Hartman calls it, this embedded green hate in the environmental movement, why the environmental movement is not so innocent and how it struggles to take on questions of social justice. So that was really my first passion. So when I turned to looking at climate anxiety, I was sort of wondering where the justice was in this question around climate anxiety. And my first feelings about it was, this is a hot topic. Everyone wants to talk about it. So I'm going to run with it because it's so exciting that there's a huge community of people who want to teach and learn about it. But I did notice with a colleague of mine named Jade Sasser, who's publishing a book right now on reproductive refusal. She was really central for me to help me think through, why is the spaces that we're showing up to think about climate emotions, they're even whiter than the environmental spaces we had been in before. And that was because the sort of justice lens that had already kind of hit the environmental spaces had not quite hit the climate emotion spaces yet. And frankly, it's been pretty slow to hit the climate spaces too. So, that was one of the reasons that it took a while for me to figure out what is the racial justice lens on this question of climate emotions. And now, a couple of years later, this is really the topic of most of my passion. And Jade and Blanche Verley and I are hosting a conference at Riverside, UC Riverside in April, called Environment, Justice, and the Politics of Emotions, because we really want to stage a conversation between all these folks. But yeah, it took a little bit for me to figure out where's the justice lens to this question. And that essay from the Scientific American was my first attempt to kind of untangle some of those questions. And where one of the first places that happened actually was with a student, of course. So I had a Latina student who was in a class who, when a couple of, the anguish and despair that was circulating around this particular class one time was I hadn't even noticed it, but now, of course, I have a better lens, but it was mostly being promulgated by a couple of white men, male students. And this Latina student stood up at some point and was giving a report on something and said something about all this white fragility stuff. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, she just called their anguish about the climate white fragility. Blew my mind. I was like, that's an analysis. I got to explore that. So that was really the beginning that planted the seed. And then Jade and I trying to think through, why are these spaces not, why is climate emotions and racial justice conversations not coming together? And yeah, that's where it all started. And the article was really about thinking through, is climate anxiety a kind of white fragility? And I honestly, after a lot of thinking about it, there's a both and, the answer is not clear. And I regret that Scientific American gave that article that title, because that's not the title I would have wanted, but it did, I suppose, get a lot of circulation. So for better or for worse.
It's so interesting that you said the but and, because I think it was also one of the things that we wanted to talk with you about, because when I saw the article, it almost worried me that it would cause people to not take eco-anxiety or climate anxiety seriously as well.
Absolutely. Faith, you hit the nail on the head. I still have that anxiety. I'm like, man, that title put people off thinking about climate anxiety. And, then you had that wonderful Yes magazine article with Jennifer Uchendu, the Nigerian sustainability, climate justice, feminist activist, awesome person. She had that article about let's move beyond climate anxiety, although she actually embraces climate anxiety as a term. So it's a weird paradox there. But there's a sort of move against, the article has been gotten a lot of circulation on TikTok with a particular interviewer. And I do fear that the soundbite version of the article, because of the title, is going to make people just assume climate anxiety is white, and that's that, and not dive deep into it.
Right. And it was interesting. When I read your article, I was like, well, yeah, duh. Right. Because there was a part of me where it's like, if we're talking about a fear of living in a planet that is not inhabitable, people of color in our communities have already been living on a planet that is not inhabitable for multiple different reasons. Right. We're already, whether it's access to land, or whether it's being in communities that are polluted, or whether it's being in communities that are neglected or under-resourced, or literally living in fear of violence, or you've already had your communities being forcibly removed. Already the decision to bring children onto this planet is already a constant question, right? And so then in one of the things, right, in terms of one of the things that shows up as a symbol of climate anxiety. So it's the idea about fear of living in an inhabitable or uninhabitable planet based on the context of your life every day isn't a new idea for so many communities of color and individuals that come from those historically and ongoing under-resourced and underserved communities. That's not new. So it was interesting. So when I read the article, I was like, well, yeah, we don't necessarily need to call it something, because it's just one more thing that adds to the difficult context. And at the same time, I think it's really helpful to have a lens through which to understand what you're feeling. Yeah.
Yeah, Faith, you nailed it on the head right there. You got it all there. It's not a new thing. And some of the really cool scholarship that's coming out about this, and also more public writing, is saying climate anxiety doesn't really work as a concept for a lot of communities who are under all kinds of other pressures. And I'm thinking here of the concept of climate apartheid and climate colonialism too, that climate change is just going to be an inequality magnifier. It's just going to make all the existing systems of oppression worse and harder to deal with. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, it itself is not the problem, right? It's this other stuff. And people are on a daily basis in a struggle for livelihood and thrivability and resistance against all of those more immediate systems that, of course, are just going to get worse with climate change. So they don't really need to call it climate. I ended up trying to kind of go in a different direction to really complexify this question in an article in the Cairo Review of Global Affairs called Who Feels Climate Anxiety? And in that essay, I basically said, well, who feels it depends on who actually perceives climate change to be the threat the greatest threat in their lives. And that is entirely a matter of power, and insulation from threats, right? Who gets to perceive something as a threat is very much about your position, right? And then who gets to have access to this emotion of anxiety and what that even means. It's very culturally situated. So depending on who you are, you may or may not be experiencing climate change, but climate anxiety is an entirely different question,
Right. Yeah. Where are you now in terms of, I think, like having written that article, seeing the conversations that came from it and the way that it's been moving around and getting a lot of traction? Have you had some, recent revelations or like thoughts that you've been kind of ruminating on?
Oh gosh, Faith. Oh, yeah, I love that question. Okay, where am I now? Well, first of all, you mentioned at the end of your comment that climate anxiety is still experienced by lots of different people. So the interesting paradox, which I mentioned at the beginning of the article, but Jade's work is really bringing this forward when she publishes it. You will see much more detail. But basically, people of color, young people of color, especially women of color, care more about climate change than their white female counterparts and certainly white men, young white men. So the data out there on where the concern lies is clear. So that's not the question. So then why is it that when we talk about climate anxiety in all these spaces, the sort of mental healthification of climate anxiety means that it's still just residing in these more privileged spaces? And actually, climate itself as a concept is still not quite fully ensconced in the justice conversation. I'll still have a lot of people push back on me when I give book talks on climate anxiety saying, climate is not the problem my community faces, or climate anxiety is not the emotion that my community faces. To the extent that it touches race or touches colonization, then yes, maybe, but that's really secondary and that's really a white framework. And I hear this often. What's up with that paradox? I'm really intrigued by that paradox of we clearly see the data on people of color caring more about climate change, but not wanting to identify or call it these words. And I think that there's a really interesting, important story to be said there about people having sovereignty of how they describe their own suffering and not just putting a claim on this is what it is. You're feeling climate anxiety, you just don't call it that. It's very paternalistic, So there's a real resistance movement there. I think we ought to give some light onto. I'd like to do that work. And I also think that there's the framework of climate is inherently privileged in some ways. And so I want to untangle what kind of frameworks might we think about alternatively to climate that make this much more democratic phenomenon so that we can all kind of participate and organize around something else that more people feel like they have access to, that really is at the root of it, whether it's colonization or whether it's just inequality more broadly or something. But some folks are saying some really cool stuff out there in the climate communication worlds about health being a better frame to get bipartisanship and get justice questions addressed more clearly and centrally in the climate conversation. So I'm provoked by this idea of health as a frame, public health as a better frame for talking about climate and to get away from the politicization of climate. Anyway, so that's where I'm a little bit at in all those places. And when you hear folks like Marianne East Heglar or Adrienne Maree Brown or a lot of people who I really admire their work, they will straight outright say they feel climate anxiety. Mm-hmm. And so there is a real sense to me that this is not a black and white situation. It's complicated.
Oh my gosh. So much there that is so real, so exciting. And I'm like, wow. And I think you're right. I'm like that direction of going toward health, because I think that, and we had someone on the podcast where we did our friend Sergio Avila, and we did his episode in Spanish because he was like, I want to do it in Spanish. And like, that's who I'm trying to talk to. And one of the interesting parts of the conversation was there were no translations into Spanish for some of the most commonly used words that were being used when we were talking about environmental movements. And so that idea of literally like from a language question being lost in translation there. But I think it's true. Like I work with folks where I'm like, okay, I'm working on a feature film right now around these Black farmers here in Portland, Oregon. And even when I was working on it, I was like, is this still a documentary? I should clarify. But I was like, am I telling a climate story? I mean, it's clearly about people who are working in the earth. It's clearly about land reclamation. It's more than anything, it feels like a story about collective healing. And that's the framework that I would more likely put it on than climate. Not that this work isn't also related directly to the environment and what does it mean to have a relationship with our natural world. So it's really fascinating to hear you think those things through from where you're sitting in a more academic sphere of like, what does it mean to study this and create a new framework?
Yeah, Faith, you're hitting the nail on it again, because this is the terms by which that community wants to articulate the work that needs to be done, the resistance that needs to be done. And climate has been dominated by a lot of white people in power for a long time. And that's actually why it's so successful right now. I mean, we're worried about climate. We don't think it's being successful, but actually as a frame, it has made its day. It's arrived.
You mean the word climate?
Yeah, the word climate, and actually,
like even from global warming when they reframed it. Yeah, so interesting.
Yeah, and also just the concern about climate change is so. I mean, something like 60 to 80% of Americans are very concerned about climate change. That level of public energy around any one topic is unbelievable. So yeah, I love that, and the idea of healing too. Part of the problem with the frame of climate change is it's all in the negative frame. And we have negativity bias in our reptilian brains. And so we end up living in what Joanna Macy calls the great unraveling story, where everything's going down a handbasket. And that is not a story that actually garners any kind of, it doesn't motivate people. It actually repels people, and it makes people apathetic and check out and not be able to participate. And so when you talk about a story of collective healing, or you talk about a story of the great turning, as Joanna Macy put it, or you talk about anything that makes people feel like, oh, I'm building something I love, I'm building my future I dream for, then you're going to get participation. And so it's not just that it's a Black community's reframing of climate or unique take on climate. It is, in fact, psychologically speaking, utterly critical that we move away from that doom and gloom framework of how we're going to organize around climate change. And that's going to look like lots of different things. Collective healing is certainly one of them.
Wow. Thank you so much. Even just like so many parts of this conversation that I've loved. Also, all of the incredible people that you've mentioned, like such a big Joanna Macy fan as well. So I'm excited to just have the excuse to link to this work as well.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And thank you. Just thank you so much for being here with us. I think we could go on and on. So we're certainly going to have to keep the conversation going in a later episode. But
I was going to say, we may just have to have your own episode down the line.
Basically, we're like, we're coming to Cali.
Amazing.
You gave me a challenge because you were like, this is going to be a short episode. It's a debrief. And I'm like, oh, how do I stop myself from just going down the rabbit holes?
Same. Always.
This is just scratching the surface, though. Thank you so much for joining us. This is honestly a topic we've both wanted to talk about for a really long time, as you can tell. So we're excited to be in touch with you and keep this conversation going. And thank you for the work that you do, too, because this is such important work to be reframing and creating frameworks, to use that word, but I also know that that's a colonial word as well, but reframing how we all relate to this topic. So thank you.
The Trail Ahead is created and hosted by us, Faith E. Briggs and Addie Thompson. It's produced by Anna Agogo at Ajode Media. Angel Adriano is our audio engineer. Claire Yo is our copywriter. Podcast art is by Shar Tuiasawa. Check her out on Instagram at Punky Aloha. And special thanks to the amazing teams at Merrill and Patagonia. And we'll see you next episode.